Okay, so I have our time as 2:40. So welcome everybody to the Noyce Track 4 Lessons Learned panel, and welcome to the Noyce Summer Block Party. My name is Jack Butler, and I'm a science assistant with the Division of Undergraduate Education at NSF. I'm one of the staff on the Noyce team, and I'll be moderating our panel discussion today. We've got Doug Larkin and Greg Rushton here as our panelists for Track 4. And so I'm going to introduce the both of them and then hand it off to Doug for his portion of the presentation. So Doug Larkin is a professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Montclair State University. His most recent book is Teaching Science in Diverse Classrooms, Real Science for Real Students, published by Routledge. He served in the US Peace Corps in Kenya and Papua New Guinea and was a high school science teacher in Trenton, New Jersey, and he will be our first panelist today. Our second panelist will be Greg Rushton, who is currently the director of the Tennessee STEM Education Center at MTSU, where he leads the university's efforts to improve STEM education at all education levels. He's been a PI on 3 Track 4 projects since 2015, and currently studies science teacher leadership and retention in collaboration with researchers across the country. And Greg will be our second presenter for our panel today. So I'm going to hand it off to Doug for our first block of our panel, and Doug and Greg have both invited anyone to speak up with questions or comments in the chat box as they go. Doug?
Thanks, Jack. So this presentation is about our Track 4 research grant, and we are just finishing up year 2. Some of you may have, I talked about this at the Noyce conference last year, so apologies if this is looking a little too familiar. But Dr. Sandra Adams and I have a collaboration across the College of Science and Mathematics and the College of Education and Human Services at Montclair State University. And so I've been asked to talk about lessons learned. If we could do the next slide. Okay, so very briefly, the research project is to identify the districts where science teachers are successfully being retained. And then our research plan is to go there and investigate why, and to do case studies on site. And in particular, we're focusing on teachers in high need schools, teachers of color, and recipients of Noyce scholarships. Again, primarily focused on science teachers. Next. Okay, lessons learned. Okay, so we'll stay on this slide for a little bit. The first thing is that the starting up, and to back up just a minute, I had not really run, we had a Track 1 Noyce before this, but I had not really participated in a research team or done a research project quite like this before. Obviously, I was able to make a convincing argument that my colleagues and I had the capacity to run this project, but it was something that we hadn't done. And so we were learning along the way. And then we coupled that with the fact that we received our grant on August 15th and with a start date of August 15th. And so we had to start it up very, very quickly. One of the things that happened is that we began asking questions that our university had not yet dealt with. We were asking things particularly around doctoral students and doctoral assistants and tuition, but also even in terms of setting up some of the parameters of the grant. So for example, we were using data, one of the states that we were using data from required a very secure, dedicated server for that data. And it took us a while to set that up. So the first lesson is that we thought we could just kind of hit the ground running, but it really took almost 6 months before we were able to start doing the real work of the grant. You know, I think if we had received the grant a little bit earlier, we probably would have used part of the summer to do that. But I think even with that, I think one of the lessons learned is that we needed to build a little bit more time into getting up and running. Now that said, we did build the whole first year of our grant, and it's a 5-year grant. We built the first year as sort of a getting up and running, but I think we were a little bit ambitious in terms of how fast we thought we could move things. The second thing, and I apologize for these slides. I had them all bulleted, but I guess they're all there at once. But we'll just take it as it is there. We started having weekly research team meetings, and this is just one of those things I had seen other people doing. There's a colleague of mine who also had an NSF grant, and he was running a research team, and you know, I noticed that they had weekly team meetings, and again, this hadn't been part of my own training. You know, my research was you know, the research I had done up to this point, and this is my 10th year as a professor now, but the research I had done mostly was fairly solitary, and so having research team meetings built in a level of accountability to each other and to the project that I think was really, really helpful in getting us going. And typically, you know, there's a reserved meeting time at our university, you know, Wednesday afternoons, and so we tried to work around other meetings that were happening, but eventually we settled on a time when we could meet each week, and you know, we would budget maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours. And I think another thing that was important there is we built, you know, that time was part of the hourly, you know, when we estimated, you know, well, how much time should each doctoral student be spending on, you know, the grant work. We built those team meetings into the time. And I think that was important both in terms of setting expectations of what they were supposed to be doing, but it also kept the momentum of the project going, even through you know, the challenges of last semester, which I'll talk about in a minute. The next thing is that our advisory board meeting, which, so I'm on the advisory board for another Track 4 grant, and I really liked the structure that this other grant used. And it's very simple, but it was almost like a dissertation defense in a sense, like here's what we're doing, what questions do you have, and here's the things that we're working on, you know, what feedback is there. And so we broke our advisory board meeting into a couple chunks. We each, you know, everybody on the team was responsible for talking about a piece of the project to our advisory board. And that one we did, that was our first meeting we had. It was an all Zoom meeting. This was pre-COVID, but it looks a lot like this meeting actually, where we had everybody from, you know, across the country on this meeting, and you know, we gave them things to think about and questions for feedback that we wanted, and you know, they gave us that feedback, and I think what was nice too is we didn't need it right then and there. We wanted them to sit with the presentation a little bit and give us thoughtful feedback. That was really, really helpful. And I think that changed, you know, and so we weren't ready for an advisory board meeting at the end of the first year. We didn't quite have enough to get advice back on. So it was only after we were at the point where we were ready to start doing the case studies. And I think that the lesson learned there was, like, rather than force ourselves to have, you know, an advisory meeting on a tight schedule, it was, where in the project does this advisory board meeting make sense? And so for us, it was at the end of the data analysis period and right prior to when we started the school visits, or the the site visits. So again, that was really helpful. So the next thing is that because our project included, so it has this data analysis part, and then it had the site visit part. And one of the other things that took longer than we thought was, you know, getting the approval for the site visits. And, you know, not only did we need our own IRB, you know, approval, which, you know, actually happened at the time of the grant, but, you know, we updated the instruments, and so we kind of had that IRB process going. But then every school district itself had its own process for approving research, whether it was just a superintendent stamp of approval, or some of them actually had their own IRBs within their own district. And anybody who does, you know, work in schools knows that that can be an onerous process. I think the thing that took a little bit longer was because we were looking at state data and picking districts from that state data. We weren't necessarily going into districts where we knew people in the district. And for some of the cases that was true. New Jersey's a relatively compact state, and you know, everybody knows a guy, right? Like, you can find somebody if you need to find somebody. But you know, there's also over 600 school districts, and so some of the districts that we identified, it was tough to find that person who's going to bring our work, even if we have the stamp of NSF on there, to bring that work to the person who's going to approve it. And I'm going to talk about that when I talk about the COVID part of this. But I think just because, you know, so anybody who's doing work with school districts, just knowing that even in the best of times, it can take a while to get a project approved. So during all this time when we were some things were moving slowly, a good aspect of our project was that we had different moving parts of the project. So we needed to get a website up and running. We needed to, you know, sharpen our instruments and make sure that they were going to work the way we wanted to. So we were piloting them, and we had to get changes to the IRB, and you know, there was data analysis that we were doing. One of the pieces of feedback from the advisory board was that we construct some policy case studies, and it was actually something that we had already started, but it was affirmation that we were on the right track, so we were working on those. So so a lesson learned there was, you know, if you've only got one pathway forward, it can be tricky to know what to do if you don't have other things that your team can be doing at that time. You know, because you might be stuck on that one thing, you're just waiting for the email back. But because we had a sort of a lot of different parts of this that we could do at once, you know, we were able to keep the people that we had that were funding through this project. We were able to keep them busy, and more importantly, advance the project along. I'm wondering if we can go to the next slide with the logic model. So the thing I have here says it's possible to stick to the logic model even if the plan changes. It's a couple slides ahead. There we go. Okay, so this was probably one of the more helpful things that we did when putting our grant together. We had applied for a track for the previous year, and we were not awarded that one. But one of the pieces of feedback that we received was, hey, you know, you should really use a logic model. It'd probably be very helpful in organizing things. And that was a key piece of advice. So thank you to anonymous NSF reviewer who gave us that piece of advice, because it's actually helped us a lot with our project now, going back to this. Especially now when, so we were able to conduct a bunch of site visits prior to our state shutdown and the schools closed in mid-March. And so we were able to do a bunch of site visits before that happened. But there's still a couple that we still need to do, at least on the New Jersey cases. And then we have a bunch of other states where we're going as well. But I think this has helped us to, you know, it's been a touchstone to return to as we think about, you know, what are some of the things that we can do, or how do we change our model now based upon the realities that we actually have. And so, you know, I know that, you know, plans change, and you know, there's nothing like looking at a proposal you wrote over a year ago and being like, oh my gosh, you know, this is now funded, we have to do it. But, you know, I have this sort of thing I tell myself, you know, trust my past self. If I thought that things were a good idea a year ago, it's, you know, the likelihood is high that there's still good ideas now, or at least I can go back to them and refer to these things. So we've been using this logic model quite a bit just to think about, you know, and make decisions about where to go next. You can go forward to the next slide. I think it's the last bullet point here, right? So the last thing I want to mention, and this is going to be different by institution, but our post-award facilitator is just wonderful. The thing that is hardest about managing a grant is actually managing the budget part, especially as you interface with the way that, at least our institution, there's a lot of checks on money and making sure that things are spent properly, and we want that. But I'm really grateful that we have somebody who can help me navigate that, especially as, there were already small changes from the time we proposed to year one. Particularly on the short timeline piece that, we weren't able to offer a doctoral assistantship that quickly to somebody having received it, having received the grant on August 15th. But we were able to make some changes that were okay and allowed us to make progress. And so, and this was something, again, this goes back to the starting thing. Like, I hadn't done this before in this way. It wasn't part of my experience, but working with a post-award facilitator, even on things like, so we have mugs for our project, like buying the mugs to give as, tokens of appreciation to the people who were part of our study. So I really want to encourage people, if, that's a relationship to develop and sustain. And I think I'm ready to pass it off to Greg. Or I haven't been monitoring the chat here. We'll do questions at the end, right, Jack? Is that how we're doing this?
That's right. There will be a dedicated question time at the end, but if anyone has any questions immediately, they should feel free to speak up or put it in the chat. I'll give that just a moment, but if not, then we'll continue on to Greg.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I don't have any slides. Just wanted to talk through a few things, and then as I'm talking or at the end, I don't get to see you guys that often. I look forward to the time in DC to talk with other PIs. So I hope we can spend bulk of our time doing that. So one of our track 3 projects is completed. We analyzed some secondary data from the Educational Testing Service. They provided 10 years of licensure data, testing data for the Praxis 2, which is used in between 30 and 40 of our states yearly. And they write the exams for a lot of the other ones that don't use the Praxis. So we thought by analyzing the demographic data and the achievement data for those 10 years, we'd have a sense of how well many of our pre-service teachers are prepared with respect to their content knowledge, at least by measured by Praxis 2. And we're writing up the earth science test results right now, but they're pretty reflective of the other subjects we've looked at. We've looked at mathematics, biology, chemistry, physics, general science, and also earth science. So we can speak really across these subject areas as you guys are interested. We found that the test population in those 10 years was not very diverse. It was primarily white, which may explain some of the lack of diversity in our in-service teacher population. We saw consistent race and gender achievement gaps. And we did see that the majors in the disciplines outperformed those that were taking those exams out of field. We did find that GPA, reported GPA, was a pretty good indicator of test performance, and that their participation in a particular type of teacher preparation program wasn't predictive of their outcome. And we didn't see any significant differences between those test takers that indicated they were coming from Noyce versus non-Noyce awarded institutions. I think the challenge in that project primarily was getting the data and working with an agency that was not focused primarily on research. So Doug had mentioned several challenges with a particular type of research project. And you know, ETS, you know, writes tests, and they you know, they're a commercial entity. So that was a little bit challenging trying to work on a research project with them. But it ended up, you know, pretty good. So the second project was studying five different Noyce sites with respect to retention of their candidates in high need schools, both Noyce and non-Noyce recipients. We tried to focus specifically on schools or institutions that had been successful in retaining their graduates in high need schools. We're trying to understand if we could find themes across them that we could share out with the community, as it seems like a lot of us don't really know what everyone else is doing and how it's working for them. So we're writing up several papers that summarize the results. One is we feel like we've got a pretty decent instrument that measures science and math teacher identity, which we are finding is predictive of their intention to persist in the field. We're looking specifically in that project about around their social networks, their professional networks. That is who they speak to about pedagogy, how to teach. And we find that the ones that are most committed have a higher proportion of energizing contacts. And we also found a pretty neat outcome, which was that the local network, that is who they talk to at the school level, who they're interacting with, is pretty predictive of their job satisfaction. That is whether they want to stay in the school or not, but it's not very predictive of their career commitment. That is whether they want to remain a teacher. So we've also done some mediation analysis, and that's, we initially hypothesized that the teacher identity, that is who the candidate thinks they are with respect to teaching, is going to inform who they hang out with, who their social network is. And then that social network is either going to support that identity or challenge that identity, either say things like, hey, you really shouldn't be a teacher, you're not very good at this, or you could do something else, or you really belong here, you're really needed. And that would, and the characteristics of the network would be predictive of their persistence or their intention to persist. But actually it turns out that it's actually the opposite for the 250 or so teachers that we've studied, and that is that really the social network informs the identity piece. That is, new teachers don't necessarily have a well-formed teacher identity that is informed by the relationships they have, and ultimately that identity that's shaped is then predictive of their desire to remain. So the last project that we'll talk about real briefly is a collaborative project amongst 7 different institutions and 8 different Noyce projects, specifically around Track 3 projects or Master Teaching Fellow projects. We're interested in understanding the trajectories of these folks, of close to 200 Master Teaching Fellows, the experienced teachers with respect to remaining in the classroom or moving into a formal leadership role or leaving education. And we find in this project as well that the social networks that they're embedded in or that they form over time is predictive of some of their trajectories, and that the local factors, the local school factors are also important. And we're, as Doug was saying, we're kind of halfway through our project, so we're building some case studies that are hopefully indicative of the kinds of folks that we see across the Noyce community and trying to tell their stories. One thing we are finding that the Master Teaching Fellow projects, at least that are in our study, tend to do is they either find folks that are already exhibiting teacher leadership, and then we try to get them to work together to improve the quality of teaching and learning and to persist in the profession, or they find folks that have the potential for teacher leadership and then try to support their development of teacher leaders. So that's kind of the 2 primary ways that people are thinking about the Master Teaching Fellow projects. So yeah, Dan. So anyway, so I hope that wasn't too long. I hope that was maybe about 10 minutes or so. And And the challenges, I think, for those last two projects were in trying to understand the priorities that each of our partners had, the time commitment they had, the kind of space in their schedule. I like Doug's point about having defined roles and having different folks working on different pieces and having responsibility for them. I think when you have collaborative projects, there's a tendency for people not to want to step on other people's toes, but also not necessarily assert themselves unless there's a real strong understanding of what the roles are beforehand. So I think that's a challenge that I face in both of the collaborative projects, and that is like, what's everyone doing? What's the timeline? What's their priorities? What ownership do they want to take over the project? And how do we, meet the timelines that we set out? So I'll leave it there.
All right. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah.
So we have lots of time for Q&A. This is intended to be somewhat of a structured time to ask questions, but also to seed some discussion that will happen later in the peer conversations that will follow the next break. So we'll lead off with some questions. You all are welcome to put questions in the chat box or to raise your hands if you would prefer to ask your question vocally. To give you all time to put things in the chat box or raise your hands, I think just as a general question to start off, since we have a mix of continuing and new PIs in the audience, Doug and Greg, do you have any most crucial or powerful pieces of advice for people in new project, people starting off their new projects?
I don't know if this counts as advice, but nobody cares as much about your project as you do.
Yeah, that's right. And I just want to add to that it seems like what's being funded right now in Track 4, at least to some extent, or to a large extent, is projects where folks are not working in a solitary mode. And I think building that team, building the shared ownership and the shared vision is pretty critical up front. I agree with Doug. I mean, the primary writers of the proposal are the ones that probably have thought about this the most and have the most ideas and questions and stuff, and just bringing in the other stakeholders, including advisory board and the school districts and the participants. Like, I think that's pretty critical. I think the sooner you do that, everyone's on the same page, everyone feels valued, everyone feels appreciated, and kind of feels like they've got a stake in it. I think it's pretty critical.
This is Dan, and sort of a broad question directed to anyone who has been involved with NSF and is far along, at least in their project. I'm wondering if there's any advice or any thoughts about how you feel like you've successfully gotten the findings for projects out into the hands of policymakers and practitioners who can use them. I mean, to me, I've done lots of IES projects, and that is, as a researcher, I think that's one of the really challenging things is not actually producing the research, but getting it to people who might use it.
Yeah, I can share a little bit. We've thought about that on several of our projects, Dan. One of the things that we've thought about doing is positioning our advisory board as both experts, but also as brokers or mediators of that message. So, we try to get, for example, APLU on, or we'll get professional, science organizations, or that we try to get folks that represent the communities that we want to inform on the project and have them buy into the work. So that's one of the ways. I think kind of your traditional presentations and publications do it as well, but also looking for opportunities to do webinars or to get in practitioner journals, I think is pretty important, that we're not just writing, for the research journals. So, Doug.
Yeah, well, I mean, so Dan, you're asking that question, but you're one of those people I think when I think about, who's actually doing work and just even like having a Twitter presence, right? If you're doing a research project and you want people to know the results, like I really wasn't on Twitter before I started this, and I still have, mixed feelings about it sometimes, but in terms of disseminating research and getting, a voice out there, we can develop personal relationships with people in state, departments of ed and those kinds of things. But I think just sort of swallowing the reality that when you do this kind of work, you're also agreeing to be a public intellectual in a way, and that that's part of the ride. So you buy the ticket, you take the ride with this, and so thinking about and we're putting 5 years of work into this project. So how, and we know we're going to write, we'll write things that people will read, hopefully more than a dozen. Hopefully we'll read in a journal somewhere. Somebody told me the depressing statistic that the average journal article has three downloads. That's, but really, just this idea that we want this stuff to be out there. And so I want to encourage people. We're all located in places that have, there's the national conventions, right? But where there's also our local, science and math conventions working with teachers, and some of those teachers have strong links to policymakers. And so recognizing that, where the different nodes of influence in a network are, sometimes they occur from these top-down dissemination places, but it's also, an opportunity to have practitioners understand that the work that we do. And I've found myself saying yes to things, and I mean, I said yes to this, but I'm saying yes to other things as well, because it allows for that relationship building. But there's also some of those basic things, right? Like, so developing a website for your project. When we still have a track one, we've got a no-cost extension on it right now. But we didn't really build a website around that particular project. This one we had to. We really had to build something as a dissemination mechanism, as a place we could point people to as we did this work. So I think that's really important.
Thank you. Yes, Lee, you'll be next. And just so we make sure we don't have people talking on top of each other, would anyone with a question please indicate in the chat box that they have a question, either to everyone or privately to me, and I'll call on people in the order that I see them in the chat box. Lee.
Thank you, John. I have so I'm Lee. I'm with Texas State University. I'm going to be the new PIPD for the collaborative Track 4 grant. And I noticed that both Greg and Doug mentioned about multi-state sort of collaboration. So I wanted to get your, so how do you work across different, states? And our project is happening in both Florida and Texas. So I wanted to hear you guys' experience on that. And also in the conversation, I didn't hear too many discussion except in Doug's brief mentioning of the school district. What kind of role does a school district administrator play in this discussion? Because ultimately we're trying to solve their challenges, right? So to kind of have the right kind of science and math teacher in their classrooms. So those are my questions. Sorry. Thank you.
Well, I can say a little bit about the state piece and the school district piece. With the state piece, one of the things we found we had to do is reckon with the individual state policy context turned out to be really important when looking at least in our case, looking at teacher retention. Because whatever we're finding out about teacher retention has to be situated in the realities of what's going on in that state during the time period for the data that we have. and that some of the assumptions that, you know, we had about one state just did not hold for another state. And I'll give you a specific example in term, and this might relate to Greg's project a little bit, but, you know, teacher certification. So in New Jersey, there are specific, you know, biological science, physics, chemistry, you know, there's very specific certifications. But in other states in our study, it's just a general all-purpose, you know, science teacher certification. And so it'd be very difficult to make sense of retention rates for biology teachers, say, without attending to those factors. And there's a bunch of stuff like that. And then we also had to like put, you know, look at the national context in that. Like, and so and on our project's website, which is somewhere in the slides, but we've posted some of those white papers there. But I think that the other piece of your question, like what role do districts have, actually goes back to Dan's question earlier about how do we communicate our findings, and even if we don't want to categorize them as findings yet, how do we convey the worldview of our research, right? And so I've found that even just talking to superintendents and principals and usually directors of curriculum or HR people are involved when we have these initial conversations about bringing our project to their district. We're also communicating about our project, and we've also made a commitment of, you know, we're writing case studies on these districts, and we've you know, it's just a personal commitment of mine in my research, you know, that I want to share that research and give the, you know, whoever's the object or subject of that research has an opportunity to comment on it, and to keep that dialogue going. But it also communicates something about the way that we've even framing the problem. So just as an example, you know, in our project, we're troubling the notion of teacher retention a little bit, particularly in this idea of turnover. And throughout our project, we're arguing that turnover should not apply to people. It should only apply to positions. And it's one of those conceptual distinctions that when you follow it where it goes, it leads to some very interesting places. And so you know, we communicate that when we talk to people, and the words that we use, and, you know, our project's focus on equity and diversity is deep enough that it can't just be buzzwords for principals and superintendents. And so there's a little bit of a, you know, I don't want to say we're pushy about it, but you know, we're saying, hey, we're paying attention to this. Can you tell us how, you know, you're, you know, looking at this issue in terms of your own district? So so I think just even the way that we, you know, as you enter districts and have those conversations, you know, the way that you talk about your project can serve as a tool to communicate with people who may in turn communicate that to other decision makers. And hopefully, you know, if everything's above board and we're talking honestly about our projects, hopefully in the end it furthers the field in some useful way.
Yeah, I thought that was good.
I don't know if that answered your question, Lee.
It did.
Lee, you know, feel free to email me, or we can chat offline about it.
Thanks. Thanks, Greg.
Sure.
All right. It looks like we have another question in the chat. Our next question will be from Stamatis. Would you care to ask your question over voice, or should I read it from the chat?
I can do that. Thank you all for this, a great opportunity for us to chat. So my question is, I'm intrigued about the distinction that you're drawing, Doug, about the distinction between a position and a person. I served as the chair of the National Task Force on Teacher Education and Physics, which conducted a 4-year investigation of what the situation is in the United States in terms of the lay of the land of physics teacher preparation, but also how many physics teachers are there. And so I'm particularly interested in the implications of the distinction that you drew. Thank you.
Yeah, well, so there's a paper under review right now where we go into, and that goes back to the other point about like how do we communicate the findings of our work, and so for us, you know, we we're releasing it as we go, which I think a lot of people do in their research. But for us, this was something we really wrestled with in looking at the data, and it was born out of a frustration of, comparing different studies and, looking at this word retention, related to this concept of teacher turnover. I can say that one of the things that we look for now is that when we talk about retention, we have to put a year on it. We have to say a 5-year retention rate or a 2-year retention rate. I'm in awe of the work that Richard Ingersoll and his colleagues have done over the years. And I think one of the takeaways from that, and it's a rich body of research, is that the data source really matters. Right. So if you're looking at SAS data, that's just, did the first-year teacher stick around to become a second-year teacher? That definition of teacher turnover and retention is very different from, did this person stay to become, past that 5-year mark, which we know that once somebody passes the 5-year mark, they're more likely to be retained, and they're also, however we define effectiveness, they're more likely to be effective, more effective after that 5-year mark. So. For our study, we need 6 years of data to calculate a 5-year retention rate. And I think part of it is also, there's a humanizing function when we talk about the person, because, and I'll just use myself as an example. I feel like I've been retained, right? Even though I'm not still teaching at Trenton High in New Jersey, or Steinert High School where I started before that. I feel like I've been retained in the profession, right? So there's this notion of, if it's a person-centered view of retention, I feel like I've never left the, I've been in a lot of different kinds of classrooms now, but I've never left the profession of science teaching. Whereas the principal who hired me, 2 years after I left Steinert High School to go join Peace Corps and go to Kenya, he had a new position to fill. So from his perspective, that there was turnover, but for me, it was advancement in my career. And I think that distinction for me is helpful. Our data does not really reflect that, right? So we don't collect data in that way on a large scale, and that makes those kinds of questions difficult to answer when we talk about the career paths of large statewide cohorts of science teachers. But I do think they're important questions, and I think that's, if we look at how science teachers think about themselves in the profession, that's going to lead us to different takes on retention. And it's different from a labor deficit problem.
Sure. Didn't Ingersoll actually define this when he talked about the movers versus the levers?
Yeah, I don't know how deep down this hole we want to go, but I actually had a problem with that. I'll leave it, but I have a problem with define. It's if we look at person first language, right? And instead of if we look at person first language, we would say, a person who leaves, right, rather than a leaver. And I think that again, I didn't consider myself a leaver. Right? To me, I'm a stayer. I stayed in the profession. But to my principal, I was a leaver. But I worry about any label that gets attached to a person that way, because it doesn't necessarily have explanatory power. And that, to me, that's a reason not to use it. I don't think we should be using the phrase teacher turnover either, but we'll save that for another day.
And Stamatis, just one thing to add, we're in our 2 network studies, we also have taken up a term that's more recently used, and that's shifter. I think shift is okay. I think it wouldn't be pejorative to say Doug has shifted. He hasn't left. But I mean, it is a different role in the system than you were in before, right? I mean, from K-12 to higher ed, same thing with me.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any next questions in the chat at the moment. So I was wondering if Greg and Doug, could you speak any more on how you have had to and plan to continue adapting alongside the ever-evolving coronavirus disease pandemic?
Yeah, you want to go first, Doug?
Well, ours is we just had this research team meeting last week where we decided to upend our whole research plan. We originally had planned to, so it's a 5-year plan. The first year was get ready. Second year, case studies in New Jersey. Third year, Pennsylvania. Fourth year, Wisconsin. Fifth year, North Carolina. Right now we're having, and who knows what September is going to look like, but it's going to be hard to get into any school district in September. And our research plan does entail going to the school districts and doing in-person, visits to the school. That was a really important commitment. But I think our carefully organized plans have been upended a little bit, and if we're going to finish this project in 3 years, our data collection is going to have to look different. And there's no way that any school district is going to agree to let us in September and October. And just being realistic about what this fall is going to look like, it's unpredictable. And if I were a superintendent, the last thing I would want is some, people coming to my school where we're very carefully, controlling who can enter the school and who can't, and, third graders come on Thursdays, and, whatever it is, there's no way we're going to be let into a school. And not only that, if we're going to be doing Zoom interviews or, the whole video component adds another layer to our IRB, which we're trying to deal with. But so we're trying to figure out, a way to record these, but not record the video because we don't want video necessarily. But if we're going to do that, maybe then we don't need to separate our states out by year. And so maybe we can just put out as many invitations as we can to, to the districts that we're going to invite. And we had staggered them logistically like that, so that we were all going to, Wisconsin and concentrating the site visits in those couple of days. And now there's really, I don't know that that's going to happen, and not knowing just this fall or even further down the line what those site visits might look like, or whether they're going to be Zoom data collections. That we have a conference built in for the end of our grant with all our participant school districts and travel funding for those conferences. So it's quite possible by 2023 we'll be able to have an in-person conference. But the actual data collection, it just has to look different. That was a really hard reality to acknowledge. And it was sort of the same level when I had to decide, the decision was on me, like, are you going to try to have hybrid, a couple in-person classes this year, or are you going to go all online? It's that same level of decision, right? Like, I just hit the button, like, it's got to be all online. Like, I can't, in good conscience, put anybody else at risk for this research. So that was really hard. And I feel for those of you who wrote, or the new grantees who wrote these beautiful research plans that are now kind of up in the air now with COVID. You wrote them way before any of this was a possibility. And my heart goes out to you, because I feel you. I feel your pain. I really do.
One thing that we've done, though, as project teams, we've tried to think about, are there research questions related to the ones that we care about that could be informed by specifically the COVID kind of pandemic. So in our research project on the Master Teaching Fellows, we've tried to think about what teacher leadership could look like. What does it look like to be a really effective teacher in the classroom, or effective teacher of other teachers during a crisis like this? Like, what kinds of activities do you engage in? What kinds of attributes do you have to have? What kind of network do you need to support, and how do you do, what's the mechanism by which that happens? So, we're trying to leverage the current opportunities to answer some really important questions about the community that we all think about.
Thank you both.
What happens now, John?
Well, so there are no pending questions in our chat at the moment. We have about 10 minutes left in this block of time before we're scheduled for a break before the peer conversations portion of the schedule. So I think for maybe the next few minutes, if Doug and Greg, if you have any final topics you want to discuss or any seeds you want to plant for the peer conversations, I think that would be welcome. But I see one new question in the chat from Keith. If you'd like to unmute.
Sure. This is a question that when we have results, I always have a bit of anguish about. How significant you were talking. I was quite interested by the teacher identity sort of measure. How significant does it have to be before you really hope policymakers notice it? I mean, obviously something is better than nothing, but has your team sort of discussed comparative significance of those effects?
Yeah, one of my colleagues at my university is a statistics educator, and we talk about, p-values and effect sizes all the time. And she doesn't even like me even using the word significant. She said that's not a term that her community even acknowledges. So I'm glad she's not on this call. Hopefully she won't watch it. But for us, we still use kind of more traditional measures. I don't know that I could say your teacher identity is half of your decision to remain in the classroom. If you feel like you're not really, quote unquote, a teacher, or that you're not going to be a teacher anymore. So maybe I'll just say that these are factors that seem to be important to consider when we are looking at things like persistence and retention. In our papers, we will probably use more kind of formal language that I'm used to reading. But if you have a suggestion, besides using p-values and test statistics and effect sizes, I'm open to how the Noyce community wants to communicate these findings. But that's how we're currently doing it in most of the papers that we're writing.
Well, I guess my issue with classic significance is, you just get a bigger sample size, and usually you can get, better p-values. So we've looked at R-squareds predominantly.
Yeah.
But then honestly, if you have an R-squared of 0.1, do you interpret that as really 10% of the overall effect is through teacher identity? And so I don't know, these, as was it Doug who said, you care more about your research than anybody else. These are the things I sit and think about staring at the wall, and I'm not convinced anybody else really cares. But since you have to answer that question, I was curious.
No, yeah, I care about it. I mean, I think any of our results, you have to, take it in the context of the study design and the sample size. In terms of sample size, yeah, you can get probably a significant result, but I don't know that your effect sizes are always going to be, they're not going to be as influenced by that, right? So you could, yeah, I don't know, Dan. You do more measurement stuff than I do. So I mean, why don't you speak to how we should be thinking about these outcomes? Because you have the same kind of argument that you have to construct in your papers too, right?
Yeah, ideally, there's some way of doing cost effectiveness, and 95% of the time you can't do something like that. But if you have some way of doing cost effectiveness, I kind of think that's the right way to approach it. At least in terms of what does meet the conventional measures of statistical significance. But I also think that it's totally on point that these conventional measures of statistical significance are basically arbitrary, and educational decisions are made all the time where people are less than 95% confidence in the outcome, and so that it's you just need to write about this, hopefully in some nuanced ways that give researchers, not researchers, give policymakers a sense of how confident they ought to be in the results, and that sometimes that nuance entails making them think very explicitly about what the counterfactual is, because I think an often a default is to think that the status quo is, you're very certain about it, or that it is anchored in something that is good. And sometimes that may be right, but lots of times I think that it's not right. And I just think that in terms of these questions, and this is a great discussion. I put in the chat box, not a link because I couldn't quickly find it, but I know Matt Kraft has done some work on this. I did some work thinking a little bit about this issue with Carrie Conaway that was in Education, Finance, and Policy. But I think that basically we're talking to different audiences, and that's the way that you ought to treat it. I don't think that if you're going to send your papers and work to an academic journal for that sort of academic stamp of approval that says that it's rigorous, that's the right place to sort of get into the nuances about what is statistically significant, and perhaps not even what is a educationally meaningful effect size. Whereas I do think that those are really important things to get into in more sort of policy focused outlets. And actually, this is kind of a nice circling back to the question that I originally asked, which is how do we get the work out in ways that make it meaningful? And I'm always sort of searching for ideas on that, because I worry that a lot of good work just doesn't get noticed. But I think that putting work in a frame that is easier for policymakers and practitioners to latch onto is one of the things that we can do, in this issue about effect size and statistical significance fits squarely in that endeavor.
Thank you. I think we're coming up on the end of our lessons learned panel block. So I think this is a good point, unless anyone has any final comments, to turn it over to the break portion of the program. The program proper will resume at 3:50 with the Pure Conversations. And our great thanks to Doug and Greg for for serving on this panel, and thanks to all of you for joining us and for your questions and conversation.